become dangerous, for they are harnessed to the wrong chariot, socialism. The conclusion from all this is obvious. I have written at length, both in my book and subsequently, about my present ideas. There is no lack of material for me to be judged. Those views are not casual. They are part of me, and though I might change them or vary them in future, so long as I hold them I must give expression to them. Because I attached importance to a larger unity, I tried to express them in the mildest way possible and more as an invitation to thought than as fixed conclusions. I saw no conflict in this approach and in anything that the Congress was doing. So far as the elections were concerned, I felt that my approach was a definite asset to us as it enthused the masses. But my approach, mild and vague as it was, is considered dangerous and harmful by my colleagues. I was even told that my laying stress always on the poverty and unemployment in India was unwise, or at any rate the way I did it was wrong. You told me that you intended issuing some kind of a statement. I shall welcome this, for I believe in every viewpoint being placed before the country. Yours affectionately, Jawaharlal. Dear Jawaharlal. C. Jayan, July 15, 1936. Your letter is touching. You feel the most injured party. The fact is that your colleagues have lacked your courage and frankness. The result has been disastrous. I have always pleaded with them to speak to you freely and fearlessly. But having lacked the courage, whenever they have spoken they have done it clumsily and you have felt irritated. I tell you they have dreaded you, because of your irritability and impatience with them. They have chafed under your rebukes and magisterial manner, and above all your arrogation of what has appeared to them your infallibility and superior knowledge. They feel you have treated them with scant courtesy and never defended them from socialist ridicule and even misrepresentation. I have looked at the whole affair as a tragicomedy. I would therefore like you to look at the whole thing in a lighter vein. I suggested your name for the crown of thorns, presidentship of the Congress. Keep it on, though the head be bruised. Resume your humor at the committee meetings. That is your most usual role, not that of careworn, irritable man ready to burst on the slightest occasion. How I wish you could telegraph me that on finishing my letter you felt as merry as you were on that New Year's Day in Lahore when you were reported to have danced around the tricolour flag. You must give your throat a chance. Love. Bapu. A. What do the letters tell us about the way Congress ideals developed over time? B. What do they reveal about the role of Mahatma Gandhi within the national movement? C. Do such letters give us any special insight into the working of the Congress, and into the nature of the national movement? Source 8. Fortnightly Reports of the Home Department. Confidential. For the first half of March 1930. The rapid political developments in Gujarat are being closely watched here. To what extent and in what directions they will affect political condition in this province, it is difficult to surmise at present. The peasantry is for the moment engaged in harvesting a good ruby, students are preoccupied with their impending examinations. Central provinces and Berar. The arrest of Mr. Vallabhbhai Patel caused little excitement, except in Congress circles, but a meeting organized by the Nagpur Nagar Congress Committee to congratulate Gandhi on the start of his march was attended by a crowd of over 3,000 people at Nagpur, Bengal. The outstanding event of the past fortnight has been the start of Gandhi's campaign of civil disobedience. Mr. J.M. Sengupta has formed an All-Bengal Civil Disobedience Council, and the Bengal Provincial Congress Committee has formed an All-Bengal Council of Disobedience. But beyond forming councils, no active steps have yet been taken in the matter of civil disobedience in Bengal. The reports from the districts show that the meetings that have been held excite little or no interest and leave no profound impression on the general population. It is noticeable, however, that ladies are attending these meetings in increasing numbers. Bihar and Orissa. There is still little to report regarding Congress activity. There is a good deal of talk about a campaign to withhold payment of the Chowkidari tax, but no area has yet been selected for experiment. The arrest of Gandhi is being foretold freely, but it seems quite possible that non-fulfillment of the forecast is upsetting plans. Madras. The opening of Gandhi's civil disobedience campaign has completely overshadowed all other issues. General opinion inclines to regard his march as theatrical and his program as impracticable, but as he is held in such personal reverence by the Hindu public generally, the possibility of arrest which he seems deliberately to be courting and its effect on the political situation are viewed with considerable misgiving. The 12th of March was celebrated as the day of inaugurating the civil disobedience campaign. In Bombay the celebrations took the form of saluting the national flag in the morning. Bombay. Press Kesari indulged in offensive language and in its usual attitude of blowing hot and cold wrote, "If the government wants to test the power of satyagraha, both its action and inaction will cause injury to it. If it arrests Gandhi it will incur the discontent of the nation, if it does not do that, the movement of civil disobedience will go on spreading. We therefore say that if the government punishes Mr. Gandhi the nation will have won a victory, and if it lets him alone it will have won a still greater victory." On the other hand, the moderate paper Vivid Varat pointed out the futility of the movement and opined that it could not achieve the end in view. It, however, reminded the government that repression would defeat its purpose. For the second half of March 1930. Bengal. Interest has continued to centre round Gandhi's march to the sea and the arrangements which he is making to initiate a campaign of civil disobedience. The extremist papers report his doings and speeches at great length and make a great display of the various meetings that are being held throughout Bengal and the resolutions passed thereat. But there is little enthusiasm for the form of civil disobedience favoured by Gandhi. Generally people are waiting to see what happens to Gandhi, and the probability is that if any action is taken against him, a spark will be set to much inflammable material in Bengal. But the prospect of any serious conflagration is at present slight. Central provinces and Berar. In Nagpur these meetings were well attended and most of the schools and colleges were deserted on the 12th March to mark the inauguration of Gandhi's march. The boycott of liquor shops and the infringement of forest laws appear to be the most probable line of attack. Punjab. It seems not improbable that organized attempts will be made to break the salt law in the Jhelum district, that the agitation relating to the non-payment of the water tax in Multan will be revived, and that some movement in connection with the national flag will be started probably at Gujranwala. United Provinces. Political activity has undoubtedly intensified during the last fortnight. The Congress Party feels that it must do something spectacular to sustain public interest. Enrollment of volunteers, propaganda in villages, preparations for breaking the salt laws on receipt of Mr. Gandhi's orders are reported from a number of districts. For the first half of April 1930. United Provinces. Events have moved rapidly during the fortnight. Apart from political meetings, processions, and the enrollment of volunteers, the SALT Act has been openly defied at Agra, Kanpur, Banaras, Allahabad, Lucknow, Meerut, Raebareli, Farrukhabad, Etawah, Balia, and Mainpuri. Pt. Jawaharlal Nehru was arrested at Chowki railway station early on the morning of April 14 as he was proceeding to the central provinces to attend a meeting of Youth League. He was at once taken direct to Naini Central Jail, where he was tried and sentenced to 6 months simple imprisonment. Bihar and Orissa. There have been, or are now materializing, spectacular, but small-scale, attempts at illicit salt manufacture in a few places. Central Provinces. In Jubalpuri Seth Govind Das has attempted to manufacture chemical salt at a cost many times in excess of the market price of clean salt. Madras. Considerable opposition was shown at Visakhapatnam to the police when they attempted to seize salt made by boiling sea water, but elsewhere resistance to the seizure of illicit salt has been half-hearted. Bengal. In the Mufassal efforts have been made to manufacture illicit salt, the main operation areas being the districts of 24 Parganas and Midnapur. Very little salt has actually been manufactured and most of it has been confiscated and the utensils in which it was manufactured destroyed. Theme 14. Understanding Partition. Politics, Memories, Experiences. We know that the joy of our country's independence from colonial rule in 1947 was tarnished by the violence and brutality of partition. The partition of British India into the sovereign states of India and Pakistan, with its western and eastern wings, led to many sudden developments. Thousands of lives were snuffed out, many others changed dramatically, cities changed, India changed, a new country was born, and there was unprecedented genocidal violence and migration. This chapter will examine the history of partition, why and how it happened, as well as the harrowing experiences of ordinary people during the period 1946 to 1950 and beyond. It will also discuss how the history of these experiences can be reconstructed by talking to people and interviewing them, that is, through the use of oral history. At the same time, it will point out the strengths and limitations of oral history. Interviews can tell us about certain aspects of a society's past of which we may know very little or nothing from other types of sources. But they may not reveal very much about many matters whose history we would then need to build from other materials. We will return to this issue towards the end of the chapter. 1. Some partition experiences. Here are 3 incidents narrated by people who experienced those trying times to a researcher in 1993. The informants were Pakistanis, the researcher Indian. The job of this researcher was to understand how those who had lived more or less harmoniously for generations inflicted so much violence on each other in 1947. 2. A momentous marker. 2.1 Partition or Holocaust. The narratives just presented point to the pervasive violence that characterized partition. Several 100,000 people were killed and innumerable women raped and abducted. Millions were uprooted, transformed into refugees in alien lands. It is impossible to arrive at any accurate estimate of casualties. Informed and scholarly guesses vary from 200,000 to 500,000 people. In all probability, some 15 million had to move across hastily constructed frontiers separating India and Pakistan. As they stumbled across these shadow lines, the boundaries between the two new states were not officially known until 2 days after formal independence. They were rendered homeless, having suddenly lost all their immovable property and most of their movable assets, separated from many of their relatives and friends as well, torn asunder from their moorings, from their houses, fields, and fortunes, from their childhood memories. Thus stripped of their local or regional cultures, they were forced to begin picking up their life from scratch. Was this simply a partition, a more or less orderly constitutional arrangement, an agreed-upon division of territories and assets? Or should it be called a 16-month civil war, recognizing that there were well-organized forces on both sides and concerted attempts to wipe out entire populations as enemies? The survivors themselves have often spoken of 1947 through other words: mashala, martial law, maramari, killings, and rala, or huller, disturbance, tumult, uproar. Speaking of the killings, rape, arson, and loot that constituted partition, contemporary observers and scholars have sometimes used the expression Holocaust as well, primarily meaning destruction or slaughter on a mass scale. Is this usage appropriate? You would have read about the German Holocaust under the Nazis in Class 9. The term Holocaust in a sense captures the gravity of what happened in the subcontinent in 1947, something that the mild term partition hides. It also helps to focus on why partition, like the Holocaust in Germany, is remembered and referred to in our contemporary concerns so much. Yet, differences between the two events should not be overlooked. In 1947 to 1948, the subcontinent did not witness any state-driven extermination, as was the case with Nazi Germany, where various modern techniques of control and organization had been used. The ethnic cleansing that characterized the partition of India was carried out by self-styled representatives of religious communities rather than by state agencies. 2.2 The power of stereotypes. India haters in Pakistan and Pakistan haters in India are both products of partition. At times, some people mistakenly believe that the loyalties of Indian Muslims lie with Pakistan. The stereotype of extraterritorial, pan-Islamic loyalties comes fused with other highly objectionable ideas. Muslims are cruel, bigoted, unclean, descendants of invaders, while Hindus are kind, liberal, pure, children of the invaded. The journalist R.M. Murphy has shown that similar stereotypes proliferate in Pakistan. According to him, some Pakistanis feel that Muslims are fair, brave, monotheists and meat-eaters, while Hindus are dark, cowardly, polytheists and vegetarian. Some of these stereotypes predate partition, but there is no doubt that they were immensely strengthened because of 1947. Every myth in these constructions has been systematically critiqued by historians. But in both countries voices of hatred do not mellow. Partition generated memories, hatreds, stereotypes and identities that still continue to shape the history of people on both sides of the border. These hatreds have manifested themselves during inter-community conflicts, and communal clashes in turn have kept alive the memories of past violence. Stories of partition violence are recounted by communal groups to deepen the divide between communities, creating in people's minds feelings of suspicion and distrust, consolidating the power of communal stereotypes, creating the deeply problematic notion that Hindus, Sikhs, and Muslims are communities with sharply defined boundaries, and fundamentally opposed interests. The relationship between Pakistan and India has been profoundly shaped by this legacy of partition. Perceptions of communities on both sides have been structured by the conflicting memories of those momentous times. 3. Why and how did partition happen? 3.1 Culminating point of a long history? Some historians, both Indian and Pakistani, suggest that Muhammad Ali Jinnah's theory that the Hindus and Muslims in colonial India constituted two separate nations can be projected back into medieval history. They emphasize that the events of 1947 were intimately connected to the long history of Hindu-Muslim conflict throughout medieval and modern times. Such an argument does not recognize that the history of conflict between communities has coexisted with a long history of sharing, and of mutual cultural exchange. It also does not take into account the changing circumstances that shape people's thinking. Some scholars see partition as a culmination of a communal politics that started developing in the opening decades of the 20th century. They suggest that separate electorates for Muslims, created by the colonial government in 1909 and expanded in 1919, crucially shaped the nature of communal politics. Separate electorates meant that Muslims could now elect their own representatives in designated constituencies. This created a temptation for politicians working within this system to use sectarian slogans and gather a following by distributing favors to their own religious groups. Religious identities thus acquired a functional use within a modern political system, and the logic of electoral politics deepened and hardened these identities. Community identities no longer indicated simple difference in faith and belief, they came to mean active opposition and hostility between communities. However, while separate electorates did have a profound impact on Indian politics, we should be careful not to overemphasize their significance or to see partition as a logical outcome of their working. Communal identities were consolidated by a host of other developments in the early 20th century. During the 1920s and early 1930s, tension grew around a number of issues. Muslims were angered by music before mosque, by the cow protection movement, and by the efforts of the Arya Samaj to bring back to the Hindu fold, Shuddhai, those who had recently converted to Islam. Hindus were angered by the rapid spread of tablighi, propaganda, and Tanzim, organization, after 1923. As middle-class publicists and communal activists sought to build greater solidarity within their communities, mobilizing people against the other community, riots spread in different parts of the country. Every communal riot deepened differences between communities, creating disturbing memories of violence. Yet it would be incorrect to see partition as the outcome of a simple unfolding of communal tensions. As the protagonist of Garm Hawa, a film on partition, puts it, communal discord happened even before 1947, but it had never led to the uprooting of millions from their homes. Partition was a qualitatively different phenomenon from earlier communal politics, and to understand it we need to look carefully at the events of the last decade of British rule. 3.2 The provincial elections of 1937 and the Congress ministries. In 1937, elections to the provincial legislatures were held for the first time. Only about 10 to 12% of the population enjoyed the right to vote. The Congress did well in the elections, winning an absolute majority in 5 out of 11 provinces and forming governments in 7 of them. It did badly in the constituencies reserved for Muslims, but the Muslim League also fared poorly, polling only 4.4% of the total Muslim vote cast in this election. The League failed to win a single seat in the Northwest Frontier Province, NWFP, and could capture only 2 out of 84 reserved constituencies in the Punjab and 3 out of 33 in Sindh. In the United Provinces, the Muslim League wanted to form a joint government with the Congress. The Congress had won an absolute majority in the province, so it rejected the offer. Some scholars argue that this rejection convinced the League that if India remained united, then Muslims would find it difficult to gain political power because they would remain a minority. The League assumed, of course, that only a Muslim party could represent Muslim interests, and that the Congress was essentially a Hindu party. But Jinnah's insistence that the League be recognized as the sole spokesman of Muslims could convince few at the time. Though popular in the United Provinces, Bombay, and Madras, social support for the League was still fairly weak in 3 of the provinces from which Pakistan was to be carved out just 10 years later: Bengal, the NWFP, and the Punjab. Even in Sindh it failed to form a government. It was from this point onwards that the League doubled its efforts at expanding its social support. The Congress ministries also contributed to the widening rift. In the United Provinces, the party had rejected the Muslim League proposal for a coalition government partly because the League tended to support landlordism, which the Congress wished to abolish, although the party had not yet taken any concrete steps in that direction. Nor did the Congress achieve any substantial gains in the Muslim mass contact program it launched. In the end, the secular and radical rhetoric of the Congress merely alarmed conservative Muslims and the Muslim landed elite, without winning over the Muslim masses. Moreover, while the leading Congress leaders in the late 1930s insisted more than ever before on the need for secularism, these ideas were by no means universally shared lower down in the party hierarchy, or even by all Congress ministers. Maulana Azad, an important Congress leader, pointed out in 1937 that members of the Congress were not allowed to join the League, yet congressmen were active in the Hindu Mahasabha at least in the central provinces, present-day Madhya Pradesh. Only in December 1938 did the Congress Working Committee declare that Congress members could not be members of the Mahasabha. Incidentally, this was also the period when the Hindu Mahasabha and the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, RSS, were gaining strength. The latter spread from its Nagpur base to the United Provinces, the Punjab, and other parts of the country in the 1930s. By 1940, the RSS had over 100,000 trained and highly disciplined cadres pledged to an ideology of Hindu nationalism, convinced that India was a land of the Hindus. 3.3 The Pakistan Resolution. The Pakistan demand was formalized gradually. On March 23, 1940, the League moved a resolution demanding a measure of autonomy for the Muslim-majority areas of the subcontinent. This ambiguous resolution never mentioned partition or Pakistan. In fact, Sikha Ndar Hayat Khan, Punjab Premier and leader of the Unionist Party, who had drafted the resolution, declared in a Punjab Assembly speech on March 1, 1941 that he was opposed to a Pakistan that would mean Muslim Raj here and Hindu Raj elsewhere. If Pakistan means unalloyed Muslim Raj in the Punjab, then I will have nothing to do with it. He reiterated his plea for a loose, united, confederation with considerable autonomy for the confederating units. The origins of the Pakistan demand have also been traced back to the Urdu poet Muhammad Iqbal, the writer of Sar Jahan-e Ka Hindustan Hamara. In his presidential address to the Muslim League in 1930, the poet spoke of a need for a Northwest Indian Muslim state. Iqbal, however, was not visualizing the emergence of a new country in that speech but a reorganization of Muslim-majority areas in northwestern India into an autonomous unit within a single, loosely structured Indian federation. 3.4 The suddenness of partition. We have seen that the League itself was vague about its demand in 1940. There was a very short time, just 7 years, between the first formal articulation of the demand for a measure of autonomy for the Muslim-majority areas of the subcontinent and partition. No one knew what the creation of Pakistan meant, and how it might shape people's lives in the future. Many who migrated from their homelands in 1947 thought they would return as soon as peace prevailed again. Initially, even Muslim leaders did not seriously raise the demand for Pakistan as a sovereign state. In the beginning, Jinnah himself may have seen the Pakistan idea as a bargaining counter, useful for blocking possible British concessions to the Congress and gaining additional favors for the Muslims. The pressure of the Second World War on the British delayed negotiations for independence for some time. Nonetheless, it was the massive Quit India movement which started in 1942, and persisted despite intense repression, that brought the British Raj to its knees and compelled its officials to open a dialogue with Indian parties regarding a possible transfer of power. 3.5 Post-war developments. When negotiations were begun again in L945, the British agreed to create an entirely Indian Central Executive Council, except for the Viceroy and the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, as a preliminary step towards full independence. Discussions about the transfer of power broke down due to Jinnah's unrelenting demand that the League had an absolute right to choose all the Muslim members of the Executive Council and that there should be a kind of communal veto in the council, with decisions opposed by Muslims needing a two-thirds majority. Given the existing political situation, the League's first demand was quite extraordinary, for a large section of the nationalist Muslims supported the Congress. Its delegation for these discussions was headed by Maulana Azad, and in West Punjab members of the Unionist Party were largely Muslims. The British had no intention of annoying the Unionists who still controlled the Punjab government and had been consistently loyal to the British. Provincial elections were again held in 1946. The Congress swept the general constituencies, capturing 91.3% of the non-Muslim vote. The League's success in the seats reserved for Muslims was equally spectacular. It won all 30 reserved constituencies in the centre with 86.6% of the Muslim vote and 442 out of 509 seats in the provinces. Only as late as 1946, therefore, did the League establish itself as the dominant party among Muslim voters, seeking to vindicate its claim to be the sole spokesman of India's Muslims. You will, however, recall that the franchise was extremely limited. About 10 to 12% of the population enjoyed the right to vote in the provincial elections and a mere 1% in the elections for the Central Assembly. 3.6 A possible alternative to partition. In March 1946, the British cabinet sent a three-member mission to Delhi to examine the League's demand and to suggest a suitable political framework for a free India. The cabinet mission toured the country for 3 months and recommended a loose three-tier confederation. India was to remain united. It was to have a weak central government controlling only foreign affairs, defence, and communications, with the existing provincial assemblies being grouped into 3 sections while electing the Constituent Assembly, Section A for the Hindu-majority provinces, and Sections B and C for the Muslim-majority provinces of the Northwest and the Northeast, including Assam, respectively. The sections or groups of provinces would comprise various regional units. They would have the power to set up intermediate-level executives and legislatures of their own. Initially, all the major parties accepted this plan. But the agreement was short-lived because it was based on mutually opposed interpretations of the plan. The League wanted the grouping to be compulsory, with sections B and C developing into strong entities with the right to secede from the Union in the future. The Congress wanted that provinces be given the right to join a group. It was not satisfied with the mission's clarification that grouping would be compulsory at first, but provinces would have the right to opt out after the constitution had been finalized and new elections held in accordance with it. Ultimately, therefore, neither the League nor the Congress agreed to the cabinet mission's proposal. This was a most crucial juncture, because after this partition became more or less inevitable, with most of the Congress leaders agreeing to it, seeing it as tragic but unavoidable. Only Mahatma Gandhi and Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan of the NWFP continued to firmly oppose the idea of partition. 3.7 Towards partition. After withdrawing its support to the cabinet mission plan, the Muslim League decided on direct action for winning its Pakistan demand. It announced August 16, 1946 as Direct Action Day. On this day, riots broke out in Calcutta, lasting several days and leaving several thousand people dead. By March 1947 violence spread to many parts of northern India. It was in March 1947 that the Congress High Command voted for dividing the Punjab into two halves, one with Muslim majority and the other with Hindu/Sikh majority, and it asked for the application of a similar principle to Bengal. By this time, given the numbers game, many Sikh leaders and congressmen in the Punjab were convinced that partition was a necessary evil, otherwise they would be swamped by Muslim majorities and Muslim leaders would dictate terms. In Bengal too, a section of Bhadralok Bengali Hindus, who wanted political power to remain with them, began to fear the permanent tutelage of Muslims, as one of their leaders put it. Since they were in a numerical minority, they felt that only a division of the province could ensure their political dominance. 4. The withdrawal of law and order. The bloodbath continued for about a year from March 1947 onwards. One main reason for this was the collapse of the institutions of governance. Penderel Moon, an administrator serving in Bahawalpur, in present-day Pakistan, at the time, noted how the police failed to fire even a single shot when arson and killings were taking place in Amritsar in March 1947. Amritsar district became the scene of bloodshed later in the year when there was a complete breakdown of authority in the city. British officials did not know how to handle the situation, they were unwilling to take decisions, and hesitant to intervene. When panic-stricken people appealed for help, British officials asked them to contact Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, Vallabhbhai Patel or M.A. Jinnah. Nobody knew who could exercise authority and power. The top leadership of the Indian parties, barring Mahatma Gandhi, were involved in negotiations regarding independence while many Indian civil servants in the affected provinces feared for their own lives and property. The British were busy preparing to quit India. Problems were compounded because Indian soldiers and policemen came to act as Hindus, Muslims or Sikhs. As communal tension mounted, the professional commitment of those in uniform could not be relied upon. In many places not only did policemen help their co-religionists but they also attacked members of other communities. 4.1 The One-Man Army. Amidst all this turmoil, one man's valiant efforts at restoring communal harmony bore fruit. The 77-year-old Gandhiji decided to stake his all in a bid to vindicate his lifelong principle of non-violence, and his conviction that people's hearts could be changed. He moved from the villages of Noakhali in East Bengal, present-day Bangladesh, to the villages of Bihar and then to the riot-torn slums of Calcutta and Delhi, in a heroic effort to stop Hindus and Muslims kill each other, careful everywhere to reassure the minority community. In October 1946, Muslims in East Bengal targeted Hindus. Gandhiji visited the area, toured the villages on foot, and persuaded the local Muslims to guarantee the safety of Hindus. Similarly, in other places such as Delhi he tried to build a spirit of mutual trust and confidence between the two communities. A Delhi Muslim, Shahid Ahmed Dehlavi, compelled to flee to a dirty, overcrowded camp in Purana Kila, likened Gandhiji's arrival in Delhi on September 9, 1947 to the arrival of the rains after a particularly long and harsh summer. Dehlavi recalled in his memoir how Muslims said to one another, "Delhi will now be saved." On November 28, 1947, on the occasion of Guru Nanak's birthday, when Gandhiji went to address a meeting of Sikhs at Gurdwara Siskanj, he noticed that there was no Muslim on the Chandni Chowk road, the heart of Old Delhi. "What could be more shameful for us," he asked during a speech that evening, "than the fact that not a single Muslim could be found in Chandni Chowk?" Gandhiji continued to be in Delhi, fighting the mentality of those who wished to drive out every Muslim from the city, seeing them as Pakistani. When he began a fast to bring about a change of heart, amazingly, many Hindu and Sikh migrants fasted with him. The effect of the fast was electric, wrote Maulana Azad. People began realizing the folly of the pogrom they had unleashed on the city's Muslims, but it was only Gandhiji's martyrdom that finally ended this macabre drama of violence. The world veritably changed, many Delhi Muslims of the time recalled later. 5. Gendering partition. 5.1 Recovering women. In the last decade and a half, historians have been examining the experiences of ordinary people during the partition. Scholars have written about the harrowing experiences of women in those violent times. Women were raped, abducted, sold, often many times over, forced to settle down to a new life with strangers in unknown circumstances. Deeply traumatized by all that they had undergone, some began to develop new family bonds in their changed circumstances. But the Indian and Pakistani governments were insensitive to the complexities of human relationships. Believing the women to be on the wrong side of the border, they now tore them away from their new relatives, and sent them back to their earlier families or locations. They did not consult the concerned women, undermining their right to take decisions regarding their own lives. According to one estimate, 30,000 women were recovered overall, 22,000 Muslim women in India and 800 Hindu and Sikh women in Pakistan, in an operation that ended as late as 1954. 5.2 Preserving honor. Scholars have also shown how ideas of preserving community honor came into play in this period of extreme physical and psychological danger. This notion of honor drew upon a conception of masculinity defined as ownership of zan, women, and zaman, land, a notion of considerable antiquity in North Indian peasant societies. Virility, it was believed, lay in the ability to protect your possessions zan and zaman from being appropriated by outsiders. And quite frequently, conflict ensued over these two prime possessions. Often enough, women internalized the same values. At times, therefore, when the men feared that their women wives, daughters, sisters would be violated by the enemy, they killed the women themselves. Urvashi Budalaya in her book, The Other Side of Silence, narrates one such gruesome incident in the village of Thoa Khalsa, Rawalpindi district. During partition, in this Sikh village, 90 women are said to have voluntarily jumped into a well rather than fall into enemy hands. The migrant refugees from this village still commemorate the event at a Gurdwara in Delhi, referring to the deaths as martyrdom, not suicide. They believe that men at that time had to courageously accept the decision of women, and in some cases even persuade the women to kill themselves. On March 13 every year, when their martyrdom is celebrated, the incident is recounted to an audience of men, women, and children. Women are exhorted to remember the sacrifice and bravery of their sisters and to cast themselves in the same mold. For the community of survivors, the remembrance ritual helps keep the memory alive. What such rituals do not seek to remember, however, are the stories of all those who did not wish to die, and had to end their lives against their will. 6. Regional variations. The experiences of ordinary people we have been discussing so far relate to the northwestern part of the subcontinent. What was the partition like in Bengal, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, central India, and the Deccan? While carnages occurred in Calcutta and Noakhali in 1946, the partition was most bloody and destructive in the Punjab. The near-total displacement of Hindus and Sikhs eastwards into India from West Punjab and of almost all Punjabi-speaking Muslims to Pakistan happened in a relatively short period of 2 years between 1946 and 1948. Many Muslim families of Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, and Hyderabad in Andhra Pradesh continued to migrate to Pakistan through the 1950s and early 1960s, although many chose to remain in India. Most of these Urdu-speaking people, known as muhajirs, migrants, in Pakistan moved to the Karachi-Hyderabad region in Sindh. In Bengal the migration was even more protracted, with people moving across a porous border. This also meant that the Bengali division produced a process of suffering that may have been less concentrated but was as agonizing. Furthermore, unlike the Punjab, the exchange of population in Bengal was not near total. Many Bengali Hindus remained in East Pakistan while many Bengali Muslims continued to live in West Bengal. Finally, Bengali Muslims, East Pakistanis, rejected Jinnah's two-nation theory through political action, breaking away from Pakistan and creating Bangladesh in 1971 to 1972. Religious unity could not hold East and West Pakistan together. There is, however, a huge similarity between the Punjab and Bengal experiences. In both these states, women and girls became prime targets of persecution. Attackers treated women's bodies as territory to be conquered. Dishonoring women of a community was seen as dishonoring the community itself, and a mode of taking revenge. 7. Help, humanity, harmony. Buried under the debris of the violence and pain of partition is an enormous history of help, humanity, and harmony. Many narratives such as Abdul Latif's poignant testimony, with which we began, reveal this. Historians have discovered numerous stories of how people helped each other during the partition period, stories of caring and sharing, of the opening of new opportunities, and of triumph over trauma. Consider, for instance, the work of Kushtava Singh, a Sikh doctor specializing in the treatment of tuberculosis, posted at Dharampur in present-day Himachal Pradesh. Immersing himself in his work day and night, the doctor provided that rare healing touch, food, shelter, love, and security to numerous migrants, Muslim, Sikh, Hindu alike. The residents of Dharampur developed the kind of faith and confidence in his humanity and generosity that the Delhi Muslims and others had in Gandhiji. One of them, Muhammad Umar, wrote to Kushtava Singh, "With great humility I beg to state that I do not feel myself safe except under your protection. Therefore, in all kindness, be good enough to grant me a seat in your hospital." We know about the grueling relief work of this doctor from a memoir he entitled Love is Stronger Than Hate, a remembrance of 1947. Here, Singh describes his work as humble efforts I made to discharge my duty as a human being to fellow human beings. He speaks most warmly of 2 short visits to Karachi in 1949. Old friends and those whom he had helped at Dharampur spent a few memorable hours with him at Karachi airport. 6 police constables, earlier acquaintances, walked him to the plane, saluting him as he entered it. I acknowledged the salute, with folded hands and tears in my eyes. 8. Oral testimonies and history. Have you taken note of the materials from which the history of partition has been constructed in this chapter? Oral narratives, memoirs, diaries, family histories, first-hand written accounts, all these help us understand the trials and tribulations of ordinary people during the partition of the country. Millions of people viewed partition in terms of the suffering and the challenges of the times. For them, it was no mere constitutional division or just the party politics of the Muslim League, Congress, and others. For them, it meant the unexpected alterations in life as it unfolded between 1946 and 1950 and beyond, requiring psychological, emotional and social adjustments. As with the Holocaust in Germany, we should understand partition not simply as a political event, but also through the meanings attached to it by those who lived it. Memories and experiences shape the reality of an event. One of the strengths of personal reminiscence, one type of oral source, is that it helps us grasp experiences and memories in detail. It enables historians to write richly textured, vivid accounts of what happened to people during events such as partition. It is impossible to extract this kind of information from government documents. The latter deal with policy and party matters and various state-sponsored schemes. In the case of partition, government reports and files as well as the personal writings of its high-level functionaries throw ample light on negotiations between the British and the major political parties about the future of India or on the rehabilitation of refugees. They tell us little, however, about the day-to-day experiences of those affected by the government's decision to divide the country. Oral history also allows historians to broaden the boundaries of their discipline by rescuing from oblivion the lived experiences of the poor and the powerless, those of, say, Abdul Latif's father, the women of Thoa Khalsa, the refugee who retailed wheat at wholesale prices, eking out a paltry living by selling the gunny bags in which the wheat came, a middle-class Bengali widow bent double over road-laying work in Bihar, a Peshawari trader who thought it was wonderful to land a petty job in Cuttack upon migrating to India but asked, "Where is Cuttack? Is it on the upper side of Hindustan or the lower? We have not quite heard of it before in Peshawar." Thus, moving beyond the actions of the well-off and the well-known, the oral history of partition has succeeded in exploring the experiences of those men and women whose existence has hitherto been ignored, taken for granted, or mentioned only in passing in mainstream history. This is significant because the histories that we read often regard the life and work of the mass of the people in the past as inaccessible or unimportant. Yet, many historians still remain skeptical of oral history. They dismiss it because oral data seem to lack concreteness and the chronology they yield may be imprecise. Historians argue that the uniqueness of personal experience makes generalization difficult, a large picture cannot be built from such microevidence, and one witness is no witness. They also think oral accounts are concerned with tangential issues, and that the small individual experiences which remain in memory are irrelevant to the unfolding of larger processes of history. However, with regard to events such as the partition in India and the Holocaust in Germany, there is no dearth of testimony about the different forms of distress that numerous people faced. So, there is ample evidence to figure out trends, to point out exceptions. By comparing statements, oral or written, by corroborating what they yield with findings from other sources, and by being vigilant about internal contradictions, historians can weigh the reliability of a given piece of evidence. Furthermore, if history has to accord presence to the ordinary and powerless, then the oral history of partition is not concerned with tangential matters. The experiences it relates are central to the story, so much so that oral sources should be used to check other sources and vice versa. Different types of sources have to be tapped for answering different types of questions. Government reports, for instance, will tell us of the number of recovered women exchanged by the Indian and Pakistani states, but it is the women who will tell us about their suffering. We must realize, however, that oral data on partition are not automatically or easily available. They have to be obtained through interviews that need to combine empathy with tact. In this context, one of the first difficulties is that protagonists may not want to talk about intensely personal experiences. Why, for instance, would a woman who has been raped want to disclose her tragedy to a total stranger? Interviewees have to often avoid inquiring into personal traumas. They have to build considerable rapport with respondents before they can obtain in-depth and meaningful data. Then, there are problems of memory. What people remember or forget about an event when they are interviewed a few decades later will depend in part on their experiences of the intervening years and on what has happened to their communities and nations during those years. The oral historian faces the daunting task of having to sift the actual experiences of partition from a web of constructed memories. In the final analysis, many different kinds of source materials have to be used to construct a comprehensive account of partition, so that we see it not only as an event and process, but also understand the experiences of those who lived through those traumatic times. Timeline. 1930. The Urdu poet Muhammad Iqbal speaks of the need for a Northwest Indian Muslim state as an autonomous unit within a single, loose Indian federation. 1933. The name Pakistan or Paxton is coined by a Punjabi Muslim student at Cambridge, Chowdhury Rahmat Ali. 1937 to 1939. Congress ministries come to power in 7 out of 11 provinces of British India. 1940. The Muslim League moves a resolution at Lahore demanding a measure of autonomy for the Muslim majority areas. 1946. Elections are held in the provinces. The Congress wins massively in the general constituencies. The League's success in the Muslim seats is equally spectacular. March to June. The British cabinet sends a 3-member cabinet mission to Delhi. August. The Muslim League decides on direct action for winning Pakistan. August 16. Violence breaks out between Hindu Sikhs and Muslims in Calcutta, lasting several days and leaving several thousand people dead. March 1947. The Congress High Command votes for dividing the Punjab into Muslim majority and Hindu/Sikh majority halves and asks for the application of a similar principle to Bengal. The British begin to quit India. 14 to August 15. Pakistan is formed, India gains independence. Mahatma Gandhi. 1947. Tours Noakhali in East Bengal to restore communal harmony. Source 1. I am simply returning my father's cars, his debt. This is what the researcher recorded. During my visits to the History Department Library of Punjab University, Lahore, in the winter of 1992, the librarian, Abdul Latif, a pious middle-aged man, would help me a lot. He would go out of his way, well beyond the call of duty, to provide me with relevant material, meticulously keeping photocopies requested by me ready before my arrival the following morning. I found his attitude to my work so extraordinary that one day I could not help asking him, "Latif Sahib, why do you go out of your way to help me so much?" Latif Sahib glanced at his watch, grabbed his namaz topi and said, "I must go for namaz right now, but I will answer your question on my return." Stepping into his office half an hour later, he continued, "Yes, your question. I mean, my father belonged to Jammu, to a small village in Jammu district. This was a Hindu-dominated village and Hindu ruffians of the area massacred the hamlet's Muslim population in August 1947. One late afternoon, when the Hindu mob had been at its furious worst, my father discovered he was perhaps the only Muslim youth of the village left alive. He had already lost his entire family in the butchery and was looking for ways of escaping. Remembering a kind, elderly Hindu lady, a neighbor, he implored her to save him by offering him shelter at her place. The lady agreed to help father but said, "Son, if you hide here, they will get both of us. This is of no use. You follow me to the spot where they have piled up the dead. You lie down there as if dead and I will dump a few dead bodies on you. Lie there among the dead, son, as if dead through the night and run for your life towards Sialkot at the break of dawn tomorrow." My father agreed to the proposal. Off they went to that spot. Father lay on the ground and the old lady dumped a number of bodies on him. An hour or so later a group of armed Hindu hoodlums appeared. One of them yelled, "Any life left in anybody?" and the others started, with their crude staffs and guns, to feel for any trace of life in that heap. Somebody shouted, "There is a wristwatch on that body," and hit my father's fingers with the butt of his rifle. Father used to tell us how difficult it was for him to keep his outstretched palm, beneath the watch he was wearing, so utterly still. Somehow he succeeded for a few seconds until one of them said, "Oh, it is only a watch. Come, let us leave, it is getting dark." Fortunately, for a Baiji, they left and my father lay therein. That wretchedness the whole night, literally running for his life at the first hint of light. He did not stop until he reached Sialkot. I help you because that Hindu Mai helped my father. I am simply returning my father's cars, his debt. But I am not a Hindu, I said. Mine is a Sikh family, at best a mixed Hindu-Sikh one. I do not know what your religion is with any surety. You do not wear uncut hair and you are not a Muslim. So, for me you are a Hindu and I do my little bit for you because a Hindu Mai saved my father. Source 2. For quite a few years now, I have not met a Punjabi Muslim. The researcher's second story is about the manager of a youth hostel in Lahore. I had gone to the hostel looking for accommodation and had promptly declared my citizenship. "You are Indian, so I cannot allot you a room but I can offer you tea and a story," said the manager. I could not have refused such a tempting offer. In the early 1950s I was posted at Delhi, the manager began. I was all ears. I was working as a clerk at the Pakistani High Commission there and I had been asked by a Lahori friend to deliver a rukha, a short handwritten note, to his erstwhile neighbor who now resided at Paharganj in Delhi. One day I rode out on my bicycle towards Paharganj and just as I crossed the cathedral at the Central Secretariat, spotting a Sikh cyclist I asked him in Punjabi, "Sardarji, the way to Paharganj, please." "Are you a refugee?" he asked. "No, I come from Lahore. I am Iqbal Ahmed." "Iqbal Ahmed, from Lahore?" "Stop." That stop sounded like a brute order to me and I instantly thought now I'll be gone. This Sikh will finish me off. But there was no escaping the situation, so I stopped. The burly Sikh came running to me and gave me a mighty hug. "Eyes moist," he said, "for quite a few years now, I have not met a Punjabi Muslim. I have been longing to meet one, but you cannot find Punjabi-speaking Musulmans here. Source 3. Oh, no. You can never be ours. This is the third story the researcher related. I still vividly remember a man I met in Lahore in 1992. He mistook me to be a Pakistani studying abroad. For some reason he liked me. He urged me to return home after completing my studies to serve the nation. I told him I shall do so, but, at some stage in the conversation, I added that my citizenship happens to be Indian. All of a sudden his tone changed, and much as he was restraining himself, he blurted out, "Oh, Indian! I had thought you were Pakistani." I tried my best to impress upon him that I always see myself as South Asian. "No, no. You can never be ours. Your people wiped out my entire village in 1947, we are sworn enemies and shall always remain so." The Lucknow Pact. The Lucknow Pact of December 1916 was an understanding between the Congress and the Muslim League, controlled by the Ule-based Young Party, whereby the Congress accepted separate electorates. The pact provided a joint political platform for the moderates, extremists, and the Muslim League. Music before mosque. The playing of music by a religious procession outside a mosque at the time of namaz could lead to Hindu-Muslim violence. Orthodox Muslims saw this as an interference in their peaceful communion with God. What is communalism? There are many aspects to our identity. You are a girl or a boy, all of you are young persons, you belong to a certain village, city, district, or state and speak certain languages. You are Indians, but you are also world citizens. Income levels differ from family to family, hence all of us belong to some social class or the other. Most of us have a religion, and caste may play an important role in our lives. In other words, our identities have numerous features, they are complex. There are times, however, when people attach greater significance to certain chosen aspects of their identity, such as religion. This in itself cannot be described as communal. Communalism refers to a politics that seeks to unify one community around a religious identity in hostile opposition to another community. It seeks to define this community identity as fundamental and fixed. It attempts to consolidate this identity and present it as natural, as if people were born into the identity, as if the identities do not evolve through history over time. In order to unify the community, communalism suppresses distinctions within the community and emphasizes the essential unity of the community against other communities. One could say communalism nurtures a politics of hatred for an identified other, Hindus in the case of Muslim communalism, and Muslims in the case of Hindu communalism. This hatred feeds a politics of violence. Communalism, then, is a particular kind of politicization of religious identity, an ideology that seeks to promote conflict between religious communities. In the context of a multi-religious country, the phrase religious nationalism can come to acquire a similar meaning. In such a country, any attempt to see a religious community as a nation would mean sowing the seeds of antagonism against some other religion/s. Ma. Jinnah saw the Muslims of British India as a nation and desired that they obtain a nation-state for themselves. The Muslim League. Initially floated in Dhaka in 1906, the Muslim League was quickly taken over by the U.P.-based Muslim elite. The party began to make demands for autonomy for the Muslim majority areas of the subcontinent and/or Pakistan in the 1940s. Hindu Mahasabha. Founded in 1915, the Hindu Mahasabha was a Hindu party that remained confined to North India. It aimed to unite Hindu society by encouraging the Hindus to transcend the divisions of caste and sect. It sought to define Hindu identity in opposition to Muslim identity. Confederation in modern political language, it refers to a union of fairly autonomous and sovereign states with a central government with delimited powers. The name Pakistan. The name Pakistan or Pakstan, from Punjab, Afghan, Kashmir, Sindh, and Baluchistan, was coined by a Punjabi Muslim student at Cambridge, Chowdhury Rahmat Ali, who, in pamphlets written in 1933 and 1935, desired a separate national status for this new entity. No one took Rahmat Ali seriously in the 1930s, least of all the League and other Muslim leaders who dismissed his idea merely as a student's dream. Source 4. The Muslim League Resolution of 1940. The League's resolution of 1940 demanded that geographically contiguous units are demarcated into regions, which should be so constituted, with such territorial readjustments as may be necessary, that the areas in which the Muslims are numerically in a majority as in the northwestern and eastern zones of India should be grouped to constitute independent states, in which the constituent units shall be autonomous and sovereign. Unionist Party. A political party representing the interests of landholders Hindu, Muslim, and Sikh in the Punjab. The party was particularly powerful during the period 1923 to 1947. Secede means to withdraw formally from an association or organization. Source 5. A voice in the wilderness. Mahatma Gandhi knew that his was a voice in the wilderness, but he nevertheless continued to oppose the idea of partition. But what a tragic change we see today. I wish the day may come again when Hindus and Muslims will do nothing without mutual consultation. I am day and night tormented by the question what I can do to hasten the coming of that day. I appeal to the League not to regard any Indian as its enemy. Hindus and Muslims are born of the same soil. They have the same blood, eat the same food, drink the same water and speak the same language. Speech at Prayer Meeting, September 7, 1946. CWMG, Volume 92, p.139. But I am firmly convinced that the Pakistan demand as put forward by the Muslim League is un-Islamic, and I have not hesitated to call it sinful. Islam stands for the unity and brotherhood of mankind, not for disrupting the oneness of the human family. Therefore, those who want to divide India into possible warring groups are enemies alike of Islam and India. They may cut me to pieces, but they cannot make me subscribe to something which I consider to be wrong. Haraja 5, September 26, 1946, CWMG, Volume 92. Source 6. Without a shot being fired. This is what Moon wrote. For over 24 hours riotous mobs were allowed to rage through this great commercial city unchallenged and unchecked. The finest bazaars were burnt to the ground without a shot being fired to disperse the incendiaries, i.e., those who stirred up conflict. The district magistrate marched his large police force into the city and marched it out again without making any effective use of it at all. Source 7. What recovering women meant. Here is the experience of a couple, recounted by Prakash Tandon in his Punjabi Century, an autobiographical social history of colonial Punjab. In one instance, a Sikh youth who had run amok during the partition persuaded a massacring crowd to let him take away a young, beautiful Muslim girl. They got married, and slowly fell in love with each other. Gradually memories of her parents, who had been killed, and her former life faded. They were happy together, and a little boy was born. Soon, however, social workers and the police, laboring assiduously to recover abducted women, began to track down the couple. They made inquiries in the Sikh's home district of Jalandhar. He got scent of it and the family ran away to Calcutta. The social workers reached Calcutta. Meanwhile, the couple's friends tried to obtain a stay order from the court, but the law was taking its ponderous course. From Calcutta the couple escaped to some obscure Punjab village, hoping that the police would fail to shadow them. But the police caught up with them and began to question them. His wife was expecting again and now nearing her time. The Sikh sent the little boy to his mother and took his wife to a sugarcane field. He made her as comfortable as he could in a pit while he lay with a gun, waiting for the police, determined not to lose her while he was alive. In the pit he delivered her with his own hands. The next day she ran high fever, and in 3 days she was dead. He had not dared to take her to the hospital. He was so afraid the social workers and the police would take her away. Fiction, poetry, films. Are you familiar with any short stories, novels, poems, or films about partition? More often than not, partition literature and films represent this cataclysmic event in more insightful ways than do the works of historians. They seek to understand mass suffering and pain by focusing on an individual protagonist or small groups of ordinary people whose destinies were shaped by a big event over which they seemed to have no control. They record the anguish and the ambiguities of the times, the incomprehensible choices that many were confronted with. They register a sense of shock and bewilderment at the scale and magnitude of the violence, at human debasement and depravity. They also speak of hope and of the ways in which people overcame adversity. Saadat Hasan Manto, a particularly gifted Urdu short story writer, has this to say about his work. For a long time I refused to accept the consequences of the revolution which was set off by the partition of the country. I still feel the same way, but I suppose, in the end, I came to accept this nightmarish reality without self-pity or despair. In the process I tried to retrieve from this man-made sea of blood, pearls of a rare hue, by writing about the single-minded dedication with which men had killed men, about the remorse felt by some of them, about the tears shed by murderers who could not understand why they still had some human feelings left. All this and more, I put in my book, Siyahashi, Black Margins. Partition literature and films exist in many languages, notably in Hindi, Urdu, Punjabi, Sindhi, Bengali, Assamese and English. You may want to read writers such as Manto, Rajinder Singh Bedi, Urdu, Intizar Hussain, Urdu, Basham Sani, Hindi, Kamaleshwar, Hindi, Rahim Raza, Hindi, Narain Bharati, Sindhi, Sant Singh Si Khan, Punjabi, Narendranath Mitra, Bengali, Syed Waliullah, Bengali, Lalithambika Antharjanam, Malayalam, Amitav Ghosh, English, and Bapsa Sidhwa, English. Amrita Pitam, Faiz Ahmed Faiz and Dinesh Das have written memorable poems on partition in Punjabi, Urdu, and Bengali respectively. You may also want to see films directed by Ritwik Ghatak, Meghi Dakatara and Subarnarika, M.S. Sathiu, Garam Hawa, Govind Nihilani, Thomas, and a play, Jis Lahore 5 Vikya Oj Maya Ane, He Who Has Not Seen Lahore, Has Not Been Born, directed by Habib Tanvir. Source 8. A Small Basket of Grapes. This is what Kushtava Singh writes about his experience during one of his visits to Karachi in 1949. My friends took me to a room at the airport where we all sat down and talked. And had lunch together. I had to travel from Karachi to London, at 2:30 am. At 5:00 pm. I told my friends that they had given me so generously of their time, I thought it would be too much for them to wait the whole night and suggested they must spare themselves the trouble. But nobody left until it was dinner time. Then they said they were leaving and that I must have a little rest before emplaning. I got up at about 1:45 am. And, when I opened the door, I saw that all of them were still there. They all accompanied me to the plane, and, before parting, presented me with a small basket of grapes. I had no words to express my gratitude for the overwhelming affection with which I was treated and the happiness this stopover had given me. Theme 15. Framing the Constitution. The beginning of a new era. The Indian Constitution, which came into effect on January 26, 1950, has the dubious distinction of being the longest in the world. But its length and complexity are perhaps understandable when one considers the country's size and diversity. At independence, India was not merely large and diverse, but also deeply divided. A constitution designed to keep the country together, and to take it forward, had necessarily to be an elaborate, carefully worked out, and painstakingly drafted document. For one thing, it sought to heal wounds of the past and the present, to make Indians of different classes, castes, and communities come together in a shared political experiment. For another, it sought to nurture democratic institutions in what had long been a culture of hierarchy and deference. The Constitution of India was framed between December 1946 and December 1949. During this time its drafts were discussed clause by clause in the Constituent Assembly of India. In all, the Assembly held 11 sessions, with sittings spread over 165 days. In between the sessions, the work of revising and refining the drafts was carried out by various committees and subcommittees. From your political science textbooks you know what the Constitution of India is, and you have seen how it has worked over the decades since independence. This chapter will introduce you to the history that lies behind the Constitution, and the intense debates that were part of its making. If we try and hear the voices within the Constituent Assembly, we get an idea of the process through which the Constitution was framed and the vision of the new nation formulated. 1. A tumultuous time. The years immediately preceding the making of the Constitution had been exceptionally tumultuous, a time of great hope, but also of abject disappointment. On August 15, 1947, India had been made free, but it had also been divided. Fresh in popular memory were the Quit India struggle of 1942, perhaps the most widespread popular movement against the British Raj, as well as the bid by Subhas Chandra Bose to win freedom through armed struggle with foreign aid. An even more recent upsurge had also evoked much popular sympathy. This was the rising of the ratings of the Royal Indian Navy in Bombay and other cities in the spring of 1946. Through the late 1940s there were periodic, if scattered, mass protests of workers and peasants in different parts of the country. One striking feature of these popular upsurges was the degree of Hindu-Muslim unity they manifested. In contrast, the two leading Indian political parties, the Congress and the Muslim League, had repeatedly failed to arrive at a settlement that would bring about religious reconciliation and social harmony. The Great Calcutta Killings of August 1946 began a year of almost continuous rioting across northern and eastern India. The violence culminated in the massacres that accompanied the transfer of populations when the partition of India was announced. On Independence Day, August 15, 1947, there was an outburst of joy and hope, unforgettable for those who lived through that time. But innumerable Muslims in India, and Hindus and Sikhs in Pakistan, were now faced with a cruel choice: the threat of sudden death or the squeezing of opportunities on the one side, and a forcible tearing away from their age-old roots on the other. Millions of refugees were on the move, Muslims into East and West Pakistan, Hindus and Sikhs into West Bengal and the eastern half of the Punjab. Many perished before they reached their destination. Another, and scarcely less serious, problem faced by the new nation was that of the princely states. During the period of the Raj, approximately 1/3 of the area of the subcontinent was under the control of Nawabs and Maharajas who owed allegiance to the British Crown, but were otherwise left mostly free to rule or misrule their territory as they wished. When the British left India, the constitutional status of these princes remained ambiguous. As one contemporary observer remarked, some Maharajas now began to luxuriate in wild dreams of independent power in an India of many partitions. This was the background in which the Constituent Assembly met. How could the debates within the Assembly remain insulated from what was happening outside? 1.1 The making of the Constituent Assembly. The members of the Constituent Assembly were chosen on the basis of the provincial elections of 1946. Apart from the members sent by the provinces of British India, the Assembly also had representatives of the princely states, sent as these states joined the Union one by one. The Muslim League chose to boycott the early sittings, i.e., those held before August 15, 1947, making it effectively a one-party show, as 82% of the members of the Assembly were members of the Congress Party. However, since the Congress was itself a broad front, these members held a wide range of views. Some were atheists and secularists, others, in the words of an Anglo-Indian member, Frank Anthony, were technically members of the Congress but spiritually members of the RSS and the Hindu Mahasabha. Some were socialists in their economic philosophy, others defenders of the rights of landlords. Aside from the diversity within it, the Congress also nominated independent members of different castes and religious groups, and tried to ensure representation of women. It particularly sought out law experts. The intense debates that took place within the Constituent Assembly reflected the diversity of opinions. The discussions within the Constituent Assembly were also influenced by the opinions expressed by the public. As the deliberations continued, the arguments were reported in newspapers, and the proposals were publicly debated. Criticisms and counter-criticisms in the press in turn shaped the nature of the consensus that was ultimately reached on specific issues. In order to create a sense of collective participation, the public was also asked for submissions. There were hundreds of responses, a sampling of which gives a clue to the conflicting interests that the lawmakers had to take account of. Thus the All India Varnashram Swarajya San, based in Calcutta, asked that the constitution be based on the principles laid down in ancient Hindu works. The prohibition of cows' laughter and the closing down of abattoirs was particularly recommended. Low caste groups demanded an end to ill treatment by upper caste people and reservation of separate seats on the basis of their population in legislatures, government departments, and local bodies, etc. Linguistic minorities asked for freedom of speech in the mother tongue and the redistribution of provinces on linguistic basis. Religious minorities asked for special safeguards. And bodies as varied as the District Teachers Guild of Vizianagaram and the Central Jewish Board of Bombay requested adequate representation on all public bodies including legislatures etc. 1.2 The dominant voices. The Constituent Assembly had 300 members in all. Of these, 6 members played particularly important roles. 3 were representatives of the Congress, namely, Jawaharlal Nehru, Vallabhbhai Patel and Rajendra Prasad. It was Nehru who moved the Crucial Objectives Resolution, as well as the resolution proposing that the national flag of India be a horizontal tricolour of saffron, white and dark green in equal proportion, with a wheel in navy blue at the centre. Patel, on the other hand, worked mostly behind the scenes, playing a key role in the drafting of several reports, and working to reconcile opposing points of view. Rajendra Prasad's role was as President of the Assembly, where he had to steer the discussion along constructive lines while making sure all members had a chance to speak. Besides this Congress trio, a very important member of the Assembly was the lawyer and economist B.R. Ambedkar. During the period of British rule, Ambedkar had been a political opponent of the Congress, but, on the advice of Mahatma Gandhi, he was asked at independence to join the Union Cabinet as Law Minister. In this capacity, he served as chairman of the drafting committee of the Constitution. Serving with him were 2 other lawyers, K.M. Munshi from Gujarat and Alladai Krishnaswamy Ayar from Madras, both of whom gave crucial inputs in the drafting of the Constitution. These 6 members were given vital assistance by 2 civil servants. One was B.N. Rao, constitutional advisor to the Government of India, who prepared a series of background papers based on a close study of the political systems obtaining in other countries. The other was the chief draftsman, S.N. Mukherjee, of whom Ambedkar said that his ability to put the most intricate proposals in the simplest and clearest legal form can rarely be equaled. Ambedkar himself had the responsibility of guiding the draft constitution through the Assembly. This took 3 years in all, with the printed record of the discussions taking up 11 bulky volumes. But while the process was long, it was also extremely interesting. The members of the Constituent Assembly were eloquent in expressing their sometimes very divergent points of view. In their presentations we can discern many conflicting ideas of India, of what language Indians should speak, of what political and economic systems the nation should follow, of what moral values its citizens should uphold or disavow. 2. The vision of the Constitution. On December 13, 1946, Jawaharlal Nehru introduced the Objectives Resolution in the Constituent Assembly. It was a momentous resolution that outlined the defining ideals of the Constitution of Independent India, and provided the framework within which the work of constitution making was to proceed. It proclaimed India to be an independent sovereign republic, guaranteed its citizens justice, equality, and freedom, and assured that adequate safeguards shall be provided for minorities, backward and tribal areas, and depressed and other backward classes. After outlining these objectives, Nehru placed the Indian experiment in a broad historical perspective. As he spoke, he said, his mind went back to the historic efforts in the past to produce such documents of rights. Nehru's speech merits careful scrutiny. What exactly was being stated here? What did Nehru's seemingly nostalgic return to the past reflect? What was he saying about the origin of the ideas embodied in the vision of the Constitution? In returning to the past and referring to the American and French revolutions, Nehru was locating the history of constitution making in India within a longer history of struggle for liberty and freedom. The momentous nature of the Indian project was emphasized by linking it to revolutionary moments in the past. But Nehru was not suggesting that those events were to provide any blueprint for the present, or that the ideas of those revolutions could be mechanically borrowed and applied in India. He did not define the specific form of democracy, and suggested that this had to be decided through deliberations. And he stressed that the ideals and provisions of the constitution introduced in India could not be just derived from elsewhere. We are not going just to copy, he said. The system of government established in India, he declared, had to fit in with the temper of our people and be acceptable to them. It was necessary to learn from the people of the West, from their achievements and failures, but the Western nations too had to learn from experiments elsewhere. They too had to change their own notions of democracy. The objective of the Indian constitution would be to fuse the liberal ideas of democracy with the socialist idea of economic justice and readapt and rework all these ideas within the Indian context. Nehru's plea was for creative thinking about what was appropriate for India. 2.1 The will of the people. A communist member, Somnath Lahiri, saw the dark hand of British imperialism hanging over the deliberations of the Constituent Assembly. He thus urged the members, and Indians in general, to fully free themselves from the influences of imperial rule. In the winter of 1946 to 1947, as the Assembly deliberated, the British were still in India. An interim administration headed by Jawaharlal Nehru was in place, but it could only operate under the directions of the Viceroy and the British government in London. Lahiri exhorted his colleagues to realize that the Constituent Assembly was British-made and was working the British plans as the British should like it to be worked out. Nehru admitted that most nationalist leaders had wanted a different kind of Constituent Assembly. It was also true, in a sense, that the British government had a hand in its birth, and it had attached certain conditions within which the Assembly had to function. But, emphasized Nehru, you must not ignore the source from which this assembly derives its strength. Nehru added, governments do not come into being by state papers. Governments are, in fact, the expression of the will of the people. We have met here today because of the strength of the people behind us, and we shall go as far as the people, not of any party or group, but the people as a whole shall wish us to go. We should, therefore, always keep in mind the passions that lie in the hearts of the masses of the Indian people and try to fulfill them. The Constituent Assembly was expected to express the aspirations of those who had participated in the movement for independence. Democracy, equality, and justice were ideals that had become intimately associated with social struggles in India since the 19th century. When the social reformers in the 19th century opposed child marriage and demanded that widows be allowed to remarry, they were pleading for social justice. When Swami Vivekananda campaigned for a reform of Hinduism, he wanted religions to become more just. When Jyotiba Phule in Maharashtra pointed to the suffering of the depressed castes, or communists and socialists organized workers and peasants, they were demanding economic and social justice. The national movement against a government that was seen as oppressive and illegitimate was inevitably a struggle for democracy and justice, for citizens' rights and equality. In fact, as the demand for representation grew, the British had been forced to introduce a series of constitutional reforms. A number of acts were passed, 1909, 1919, and 1935, gradually enlarging the space for Indian participation in provincial governments. The executive was made partly responsible to the provincial legislature in 1919, and almost entirely so under the Government of India Act of 1935. When elections were held in 1937, under the 1935 Act, the Congress came to power in 8 out of the 11 provinces. Yet we should not see an unbroken continuity between the earlier constitutional developments and what happened in the 3 years from 1946. While the earlier constitutional experiments were in response to the growing demand for a representative government, the acts, 1909, 1919, and 1935, were not directly debated and formulated by Indians. They were enacted by the colonial government. The electorate that elected the provincial bodies had expanded over the years, but even in 1935 it remained limited to no more than 10 to 15% of the adult population. There was no universal adult franchise. The legislatures elected under the 1935 Act operated within the framework of colonial rule, and were responsible to the governor appointed by the British. The vision that Nehru was trying to outline on December 13, 1946 was of the constitution of an independent, sovereign Republic of India. 3. Defining rights. How were the rights of individual citizens to be defined? Were the oppressed groups to have any special rights? What rights would minorities have? Who, in fact, could be defined as a minority? As the debate on the floor of the Constituent Assembly unfolded, it was clear that there were no collectively shared answers to any of these questions. The answers were evolved through the clash of opinions and the drama of individual encounters. In his inaugural speech, Nehru had invoked the will of the people and declared that the makers of the Constitution had to fulfill the passions that lie in the hearts of the masses. This was no easy task. With the anticipation of independence, different groups expressed their will in different ways, and made different demands. These would have to be debated and conflicting ideas would have to be reconciled, before a consensus could be forged. 3.1 The problem with separate electorates. On August 27, 1947, B. Pakar Bahadur from Madras made a powerful plea for continuing separate electorates. Minorities exist in all lands, argued Bahadur, they could not be wished away, they could not be erased out of existence. The need was to create a political framework in which minorities could live in harmony with others, and the differences between communities could be minimized. This was possible only if minorities were well represented within the political system, their voices heard, and their views taken into account. Only separate electorates would ensure that Muslims had a meaningful voice in the governance of the country. The needs of Muslims, Bahadur felt, could not be properly understood by non-Muslims, nor could a true representative of Muslims be chosen by people who did not belong to that community. This demand for separate electorates provoked anger and dismay amongst most nationalists. In the passionate debate that followed, a range of arguments were offered against the demand. Most nationalists saw separate electorates as a measure deliberately introduced by the British to divide the people. The English played their game under the cover of safeguards, R.V. Tejulkar told Bahadur. With the help of it they allured you, the minorities, to a long lull. Give it up now. Now there is no one to misguide you. Partition had made nationalists fervently opposed to the idea of separate electorates. They were haunted by the fear of continued civil war, riots and violence. Separate electorates was a poison that has entered the body politic of our country, declared Sardar Patel. It was a demand that had turned one community against another, divided the nation, caused bloodshed, and led to the tragic partition of the country. Do you want peace in this land? If so, do away with it, separate electorates, urged Patel. Countering the demand for separate electorates, Govind Ballabhai Pant declared that it was not only harmful for the nation but also for the minorities. He agreed with Bahadur that the success of a democracy was to be judged by the confidence it generated amongst different sections of people. He agreed too that every citizen in a free state should be treated in a manner that satisfied not only his material wants but also his spiritual sense of self-respect, and that the majority community had an obligation to try and understand the problems of minorities, and empathize with their aspirations. Yet Pant opposed the idea of separate electorates. It was a suicidal demand, he argued, that would permanently isolate the minorities, make them vulnerable, and deprive them of any effective say within the government. Behind all these arguments was the concern with the making of a unified nation-state. In order to build political unity and forge a nation, every individual had to be molded into a citizen of the state, each group had to be assimilated within the nation. The Constitution would grant to citizens rights, but citizens had to offer their loyalty to the state. Communities could be recognized as cultural entities and assured cultural rights. Politically, however, members of all communities had to act as equal members of one state, or else there would be divided loyalties. There is the unwholesome and to some extent degrading habit of thinking always in terms of communities and never in terms of citizens, said Pant. And he added, let us remember that it is the citizen that must count. It is the citizen that forms the base as well as the summit of the social pyramid. Even as the importance of community rights was being recognized, there was a lurking fear among many nationalists that this may lead to divided loyalties, and make it difficult to forge a strong nation and a strong state. Not all Muslims supported the demand for separate electorates. Begum Izaz Rasool, for instance, felt that separate electorates were self-destructive since they isolated the minorities from the majority. By 1949, most Muslim members of the Constituent Assembly were agreed that separate electorates were against the interests of the minorities. Instead, Muslims needed to take an active part in the democratic process to ensure that they had a decisive voice in the political system. 3.2 We will need much more than this resolution. While welcoming the Objectives Resolution, Ng. Ranga, a socialist who had been a leader of the peasant movement, urged that the term minorities be interpreted in economic terms. The real minorities for Ranga were the poor and the downtrodden. He welcomed the legal rights the Constitution was granting to each individual but pointed to its limits. In his opinion, it was meaningless for the poor people in the villages to know that they now had the fundamental right to live, and to have full employment, or that they could have their meetings, their conferences, their associations, and various other civil liberties. It was essential to create conditions where these constitutionally enshrined rights could be effectively enjoyed. For this they needed protection. They need props. They need a ladder, said Ranga. Ranga also drew attention to the gulf that separated the broad masses of Indians and those claiming to speak on their behalf in the Constituent Assembly. Whom are we supposed to represent? The ordinary masses of our country. And yet most of us do not belong to the masses themselves. We are of them, we wish to stand for them, but the masses themselves are not able to come up to the Constituent Assembly. It may take some time. In the meanwhile, we are here as their trustees, as their champions, and we are trying our best to speak for them. One of the groups mentioned by Ranga, the tribals, had among its representatives to the assembly the gifted orator Jaipal Singh. In welcoming the Objectives Resolution, Singh said, as an Adivasi, I am not expected to understand the legal intricacies of the resolution. But my common sense tells me that every one of us should march in that road to freedom and fight together. Sir, if there is any group of Indian people that has been shabbily treated, it is my people. They have been disgracefully treated, neglected for the last 6,000 years. The whole history of my people is one of continuous exploitation and dispossession by the non-Aboriginals of India, punctuated by rebellions and disorder, and yet I take Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru at his word. I take you all at your word that now we are going to start a new chapter of independent India where there is equality of opportunity, where no one would be neglected. Singh spoke eloquently on the need to protect the tribes, and ensure conditions that could help them come up to the level of the general population. Tribes were not a numerical minority, he argued, but they needed protection. They had been dispossessed of the land they had settled, deprived of their forests and pastures, and forced to move in search of new homes. Perceiving them as primitive and backward, the rest of society had turned away from them, spurned them. He made a moving plea for breaking the emotional and physical distance that separated the tribals from the rest of society. Our point is that you have got to mix with us. We are willing to mix with you. Singh was not asking for separate electorates, but he felt that reservation of seats in the legislature was essential to allow tribals to represent themselves. It would be a way, he said, of compelling others to hear the voice of tribals, and come near them. 3.3 We were suppressed for thousands of years. How were the rights of the depressed castes to be defined by the Constitution? During the national movement, Ambedkar had demanded separate electorates for the depressed castes, and Mahatma Gandhi had opposed it, arguing that this would permanently segregate them from the rest of society. How could the Constituent Assembly resolve this opposition? What kinds of protection were the depressed castes to be provided? Some members of the depressed castes emphasized that the problem of the untouchables could not be resolved through protection and safeguards alone. Their disabilities were caused by the social norms and the moral values of caste society. Society had used their services and labor but kept them at a social distance, refusing to mix with them or dine with them or allow them entry into temples. "We have been suffering, but we are prepared to suffer no more," said J. Nagappa from Madras. "We have realized our responsibilities. We know how to assert ourselves." Nagappa pointed out that numerically the depressed castes were not a minority, they formed between 20 and 25% of the total population. Their suffering was due to their systematic marginalization, not their numerical insignificance. They had no access to education, no share in the administration. Addressing the assembly, K.J. Khandarkar of the Central Provinces said, "We were suppressed for thousands of years. Suppressed to such an extent that neither our minds nor our bodies and now even our hearts work, nor are we able to march forward. This is the position." After the partition violence, Ambedkar too no longer argued for separate electorates. The Constituent Assembly finally recommended that untouchability be abolished, Hindu temples be thrown open to all castes, and seats in legislatures and jobs in government offices be reserved for the lowest castes. Many recognized that this could not solve all problems. Social discrimination could not be erased only through constitutional legislation, there had to be a change in the attitudes within society. But the measures were welcomed by the democratic public. 4. The powers of the state. One of the topics most vigorously debated in the Constituent Assembly was the respective rights of the central government and the states. Among those arguing for a strong center was Jawaharlal Nehru. As he put it in a letter to the President of the Constituent Assembly, "Now that partition is a settled fact, it would be injurious to the interests of the country to provide for a weak central authority which would be incapable of ensuring peace, of coordinating vital matters of common concern and of speaking effectively for the whole country in the international sphere." The draft constitution provided for 3 lists of subjects: union, state, and concurrent. The subjects in the first list were to be the preserve of the central government, while those in the second list were vested with the states. As for the third list, here center and state shared responsibility. However, many more items were placed under exclusive union control than in other federations, and more placed on the concurrent list too than desired by the provinces. The union also had control of minerals and key industries. Besides, Article 356 gave the center the powers to take over a state administration on the recommendation of the governor. The Constitution also mandated for a complex system of fiscal federalism. In the case of some taxes, for instance, customs duties and company taxes, the center retained all the proceeds. In other cases, such as income tax and excise duties, it shared them with the states. In still other cases, for instance, estate duties, it assigned them wholly to the states. The states, meanwhile, could levy and collect certain taxes on their own. These included land and property taxes, sales tax, and the hugely profitable tax on bottled liquor. 4.1 The center is likely to break. The rights of the states were most eloquently defended by K. Santhanam from Madras. A reallocation of powers was necessary, he felt, to strengthen not only the states but also the center. There is almost an obsession that by adding all kinds of powers to the center we can make it strong. This was a misconception, said Santhanam. If the center was overburdened with responsibilities, it could not function effectively. By relieving it of some of its functions, and transferring them to the states, the center could, in fact, be made stronger. As for the states, Santhanam felt that the proposed allocation of powers would cripple them. The fiscal provisions would impoverish the provinces since most taxes, except land revenue, had been made the preserve of the center. Without finances, how could the states undertake any project of development? I do not want any constitution in which the unit has to come to the center and say I cannot educate my people. I cannot give sanitation, give me a dole for the improvement of roads, of industries. Let us rather wipe out the federal system and let us have unitary system. Santhanam predicted a dark future if the proposed distribution of powers was adopted without further scrutiny. In a few years, he said, all the provinces would rise in revolt against the centre. Many others from the provinces echoed the same fears. They fought hard for fewer items to be put on the concurrent and union lists. A member from Orissa warned that the centre is likely to break since powers had been excessively centralized under the constitution. 4.2 What we want today is a strong government. The argument for greater power to the provinces provoked a strong reaction in the assembly. The need for a strong centre had been underlined on numerous occasions since the Constituent Assembly had begun its sessions. Ambedkar had declared that he wanted a strong and united centre, here, much stronger than the centre we had created under the Government of India Act of 1935. Reminding the members of the riots and violence that was ripping the nation apart, many members had repeatedly stated that the powers of the centre had to be greatly strengthened to enable it to stop the communal frenzy. Reacting to the demands for giving power to the provinces, Gopalaswamy Iyengar declared that the centre should be made as strong as possible. One member from the United Provinces, Balakrishna Sharma, reasoned at length that only a strong centre could plan for the well-being of the country, mobilize the available economic resources, establish a proper administration, and defend the country against foreign aggression. Before partition, the Congress had agreed to grant considerable autonomy to the provinces. This had been part of an effort to assure the Muslim League that within the provinces where the Muslim League came to power the centre would not interfere. After partition, most nationalists changed their position because they felt that the earlier political pressures for a decentralized structure were no longer there. There was already a unitary system in place, imposed by the colonial government. The violence of the times gave a further push to centralization, now seen as necessary both to forestall chaos and to plan for the country's economic development. The constitution thus showed a distinct bias towards the rights of the Union of India over those of its constituent states. 5. The language of the nation. How could the nation be forged when people in different regions spoke different languages, each associated with its own cultural heritage? How could people listen to each other, or connect with each other, if they did not know each other's language? Within the Constituent Assembly, the language issue was debated over many months, and often generated intense arguments. By the 1930s, the Congress had accepted that Hindustani ought to be the national language. Mahatma Gandhi felt that everyone should speak in a language that common people could easily understand. Hindustani, a blend of Hindi and Urdu, was a popular language of a large section of the people of India, and it was a composite language enriched by the interaction of diverse cultures. Over the years it had incorporated words and terms from very many different sources, and was therefore understood by people from various regions. This multicultural language, Mahatma Gandhi thought, would be the ideal language of communication between diverse communities. It could unify Hindus and Muslims, and people of the North and the South. From the end of the 19th century, however, Hindustani as a language had been gradually changing. As communal conflicts deepened, Hindi and Urdu also started growing apart. On the one hand, there was a move to Sanskritise Hindi, purging it of all words of Persian and Arabic origin. On the other hand, Urdu was being increasingly Persianized. As a consequence, language became associated with the politics of religious identities. Mahatma Gandhi, however, retained his faith in the composite character of Hindustani. 5.1 A plea for Hindi. In one of the earliest sessions of the Constituent Assembly, R. V. Dhilkar, a congressman from the United Provinces, made an aggressive plea that Hindi be used as the language of constitution making. When told that not everyone in the assembly knew the language, Dhilkar retorted, "People who are present in this house to fashion a constitution for India and do not know Hindustani are not worthy to be members of this assembly. They better leave." As the house broke up in commotion over these remarks, Dhilkar proceeded with his speech in Hindi. On this occasion peace in the House was restored through Jawaharlal Nehru's intervention, but the language issue continued to disrupt proceedings and agitate members over the subsequent 3 years. Almost 3 years later, on September 12, 1947, Dhilkar's speech on the language of the nation once again sparked off a huge storm. By now the Language Committee of the Constituent Assembly had produced its report and had thought of a compromise formula to resolve the deadlock between those who advocated Hindi as the national language and those who opposed it. It had decided, but not yet formally declared, that Hindi in the Devanagari script would be the official language, but the transition to Hindi would be gradual. For the first 15 years, English would continue to be used for all official purposes. Each province was to be allowed to choose one of the regional languages for official work within the province. By referring to Hindi as the official rather than the national language, the Language Committee of the Constituent Assembly hoped to placate ruffled emotions and arrive at a solution that would be acceptable to all. Dhilkar was not one who liked such an attitude of reconciliation. He wanted Hindi to be declared not an official language, but a national language. He attacked those who protested that Hindi was being forced on the nation, and mocked at those who said, in the name of Mahatma Gandhi, that Hindustani rather than Hindi ought to be the national language. Sir, nobody can be more happy than myself that Hindi has become the official language of the country. Some say that it is a concession to Hindi language. I say no. It is a consummation of a historic process. What particularly perturbed many members was the tone in which Dhilkar was arguing his case. Several times during his speech, the President of the Assembly interrupted Dhilkar and told him, "I do not think you are advancing your case by speaking like this." But Dhilkar continued nonetheless. 5.2 The fear of domination. A day after Dhilkar spoke, Srimati G. Durgabai from Madras explained her worries about the way the discussion was developing. Mr. President, the question of national language for India, which was an almost agreed proposition until recently, has suddenly become a highly controversial issue. Whether rightly or wrongly, the people of non-Hindi-speaking areas have been made to feel that this fight, or this attitude on behalf of the Hindi-speaking areas, is a fight for effectively preventing the natural influence of other powerful languages of India on the composite culture of this nation. Durgabai informed the House that the opposition in the South against Hindi was very strong. The opponents feel perhaps justly that this propaganda for Hindi cuts at the very root of the provincial languages, yet, she along with many others had obeyed the call of Mahatma Gandhi and carried on Hindi propaganda in the South, braved resistance, started schools and conducted classes in Hindi. Now what is the result of it all? Asked Durgabai. I am shocked to see this agitation against the enthusiasm with which we took to Hindi in the early years of the century. She had accepted Hindustani as the language of the people, but now that language was being changed, words from Urdu and other regional languages were being taken out. Any move that eroded the inclusive and composite character of Hindustani, she felt, was bound to create anxieties and fears amongst different language groups. As the discussion became acrimonious, many members appealed for a spirit of accommodation. A member from Bombay, Sri Shankara Odeo, stated that as a congressman and a follower of Mahatma Gandhi he had accepted Hindustani as a language of the nation, but he warned, if you want my wholehearted support for Hindi, you must not do now anything which may raise my suspicions and which will strengthen my fears. T.A. Ramalingam Chettiar from Madras emphasized that whatever was done had to be done with caution. The cause of Hindi would not be helped if it was pushed too aggressively. The fears of the people, even if they were unjustified, had to be allayed, or else there will be bitter feelings left behind. When we want to live together and form a united nation, he said, there should be mutual adjustment and no question of forcing things on people. The Constitution of India thus emerged through a process of intense debate and discussion. Many of its provisions were arrived at through a process of give and take, by forging a middle ground between two opposed positions. However, on one central feature of the Constitution there was substantial agreement. This was on the granting of the vote to every adult Indian. This was an unprecedented act of faith, for in other democracies the vote had been granted slowly, and in stages. In countries such as the United States and the United Kingdom, only men of property were first granted the vote, then, men with education were also allowed into the charmed circle. After a long and bitter struggle, men of working class or peasant background were also given the right to vote. An even longer struggle was required to grant this right to women. A second important feature of the Constitution was its emphasis on secularism. There was no ringing pronouncement of secularism in the preamble, but operationally, its key features as understood in Indian contexts were spelled out in an exemplary manner. This was done through the carefully drafted series of fundamental rights to freedom of religion, Articles 25 to 28, cultural and educational rights, Articles 29, 30, and rights to equality, Articles 14, 16, 17. All religions were guaranteed equal treatment by the state and given the right to maintain charitable institutions. The state also sought to distance itself from religious communities, banning compulsory religious instructions in state-run schools and colleges, and declaring religious discrimination in employment to be illegal. However, a certain legal space was created for social reform within communities, a space that was used to ban untouchability and introduce changes in personal and family laws. In the Indian variant of political secularism, then, there has been no absolute separation of state from religion, but a kind of judicious distance between the two. The Constituent Assembly debates help us understand the many conflicting voices that had to be negotiated in framing the Constitution, and the many demands that were articulated. They tell us about the ideals that were invoked and the principles that the makers of the Constitution operated with. But in reading these debates we need to be aware that the ideals invoked were very often reworked according to what seemed appropriate within a context. At times the members of the Assembly also changed their ideas as the debate unfolded over 3 years. Hearing others argue, some members rethought their positions, opening their minds to contrary views, while others changed their views in reaction to the events around. 1945. Timeline. 26 July Labour government comes into power in Britain. December-January general elections in India. 1946. 16. May. Cabinet mission announces its constitutional scheme. June 6. Muslim League accepts Cabinet mission's constitutional scheme. 16. June. Cabinet mission presents scheme for the formation of an interim government at the centre. September 2 Congress forms interim government with Nehru as the Vice President. 13 October Muslim League decides to join the interim government. 3 to December 6 British Prime Minister, Attlee, meets some Indian leaders, talks fail. December 9 Constituent Assembly begins its sessions. 1947. 29 January Muslim League demands dissolution of Constituent Assembly. 16. July. Last meeting of the interim government. 11. August. Jinnah elected President of the Constituent Assembly of Pakistan. 14. August. Pakistan Independence, celebrations in Karachi. 14 to August 15 at midnight India celebrates independence. 1949. December Constitution is signed. Figure 15.3. Jawaharlal 5 EHRU speaking in the Constituent Assembly at midnight ON 14 August 1947. It was on this day that Nehru gave his famous speech that began with the following lines. Long years ago we made a tryst with destiny, and now the time comes when we shall redeem our pledge, not wholly or in full measure, but very substantially. At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world sleeps, India will awake to life and freedom. Source 1. We are not going just to copy. This is what Jawaharlal Nehru said in his famous speech of December 13, 1946. My mind goes back to the various constituent assemblies that have gone before and of what took place at the making of the great American nation when the fathers of that nation met and fashioned out a constitution which has stood the test of so many years, more than a century and a half, and of the great nation which has resulted, which has been built up on the basis of that constitution. My mind goes back to that mighty revolution which took place also over 150 years ago, and to that constituent assembly that met in that gracious and lovely city of Paris, which has fought so many battles for freedom, to the difficulties that constituent assembly had, and to how the king and other authorities came in its way, and still it continued. The House will remember that when these difficulties came and even the room for a meeting was denied to the then constituent assembly, they betook themselves to an open tennis court and met there and took the oath, which is called the oath of the tennis court, that they continued meeting in spite of kings, in spite of the others, and did not disperse till they had finished the task they had undertaken. Well, I trust that it is in that solemn spirit that we too are meeting here, and that we, too, whether we meet in this chamber or other chambers, or in the fields or in the marketplace, will go on meeting and continue our work till we have finished it. Then my mind goes back to a more recent revolution which gave rise to a new type of state, the revolution that took place in Russia, and out of which has arisen the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics, another mighty country which is playing a tremendous part in the world, not only a mighty country but for us in India, a neighboring country. So our mind goes back to these great examples, and we seek to learn from their success and to avoid their failures. Perhaps we may not be able to avoid failures because some measure of failure is inherent in human effort. Nevertheless, we shall advance, I am certain, in spite of obstructions and difficulties, and achieve and realize the dream that we have dreamt so long. We say that it is our firm and solemn resolve to have an independent sovereign republic. India is bound to be sovereign, it is bound to be independent, and it is bound to be a republic. Now, some friends have raised the question, why have you not put in the word democratic here? Well, I told them that it is conceivable, of course, that a republic may not be democratic, but the whole of our past is witness to this fact that we stand for democratic institutions. Obviously we are aiming at democracy and nothing less than a democracy. What form of democracy, what shape it might take is another matter. The democracies of the present day, many of them in Europe and elsewhere, have played a great part in the world's progress. Yet it may be doubtful if those democracies may not have to change their shape somewhat before long if they have to remain completely democratic. We are not going just to copy, I hope, a certain democratic procedure or an institution of a so-called democratic country. We may improve upon it. In any event, whatever system of government we may establish here must fit in with the temper of our people and be acceptable to them. We stand for democracy. It will be for this House to determine what shape to give to that democracy, the fullest democracy, I hope. The House will notice that in this resolution, although we have not used the word democratic because we thought it is obvious that the word republic contains that word and we did not want to use unnecessary words and redundant words, but we have done something much more than using the word. We have given the content of democracy in this resolution, and not only the content of democracy but the content, if I may say so, of economic democracy in this resolution. Others might take objection to this resolution on the ground that we have not said that it should be a socialist state. Well, I stand for socialism, and, I hope, India will stand for socialism, and that India will go towards the constitution of a socialist state, and I do believe that the whole world will have to go that way. Source 2. CO5 Statute 5T Assembly Debates, CO5 Statutio 5AL Assembly Debate, Volume 1. That is very good, sir. Bold words, noble words. Somnath Lahiri said. Well, sir, I must congratulate Pandit Nehru for the fine expression he gave to the spirit of the Indian people when he said that no imposition from the British will be accepted by the Indian people. Imposition would be resented and objected to, he said, and he added that if need be we will walk the valley of struggle. That is very good, sir. Bold words, noble words. But the point is to see when and how are you going to apply that challenge. Well, sir, the point is that the imposition is here right now. Not only has the British plan made any future constitution dependent on a treaty satisfactory to the Britisher, but it suggests that for every little difference you will have to run to the federal court or dance attendance there in England, or to call on the British Prime Minister Clement Attlee or someone else. Not only is it a fact that this Constituent Assembly, whatever plans we may be hatching, we are under the shadow of British guns, British Army, their economic and financial stranglehold, which means that the final power is still in the British hands and the question of power has not yet been finally decided, which means the future is not yet completely in our hands. Not only that, but the statements made by Attlee and others recently have made it clear that if need be, they will even threaten you with division entirely. This means, sir, there is no freedom in this country. As Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel put it some days ago, we have freedom only to fight among ourselves. That is the only freedom we have got. Therefore, our humble suggestion is that it is not a question of getting something by working out this plan, but to declare independence here and now and call upon the interim government, call upon the people of India, to stop fratricidal warfare and look out against its enemy, which still has the whip hand, the British imperialism, and go together to fight it and then resolve our claims afterwards when we will be free. CO5 STITUTIO5AL Assembly Debate, Volume 1. The British element is gone, but they have left the mischief behind. Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel said. It is no use saying that we ask for separate electorates, because it is good for us. We have heard it long enough. We have heard it for years, and as a result of this agitation we are now a separate nation. Can you show me one free country where there are separate electorates? If so, I shall be prepared to accept it. But in this unfortunate country, if this separate electorate is going to be persisted in, even after the division of the country, woe betide the country, it is not worth living in. Therefore, I say, it is not for my good alone, it is for your own good that I say it, forget the past. One day, we may be united. The British element is gone, but they have left the mischief behind. We do not want to perpetuate that mischief. Here. When the British introduced this element, they had not expected that they will have to go so soon. They wanted it for their easy administration. That is all right. But they have left the legacy behind. Are we to get out of it or not? CO5 Statutio 5AL Assembly Debate, Volume 5. Source 4. I believe separate electorates will be suicidal to the minorities. During the debate on August 27, 1947, Govind Ballabhai Pant said, I believe separate electorates will be suicidal to the minorities and will do them tremendous harm. If they are isolated forever, they can never convert themselves into a majority, and the feeling of frustration will cripple them even from the very beginning. What is it that you desire, and what is our ultimate objective? Do the minorities always want to remain as minorities, or do they ever expect to form an integral part of a great nation and as such to guide and control its destinies? If they do, can they ever achieve that aspiration and that ideal if they are isolated from the rest of the community? I think it would be extremely dangerous for them if they were segregated from the rest of the community and kept aloof in an airtight compartment where they would have to rely on others even for the air they breathe. The minorities, if they are returned by separate electorates, can never have any effective voice. There cannot be any divided loyalty. CO5 Statutio 5AL Assembly Debate, Volume 2. Govind Ballabhai Pant argued that in order to become loyal citizens, people had to stop focusing only on the community and the self. For the success of democracy, one must train himself in the art of self-discipline. In democracies, one should care less for himself and more for others. There cannot be any divided loyalty. All loyalties must exclusively be centered round the state. If in a democracy, you create rival loyalties, or you create a system in which any individual or group, instead of suppressing his extravagance, cares not for larger or other interests, then democracy is doomed. CO5 Statutio 5AL Assembly Debate, Volume 2. The real minorities are the masses of this country. Welcoming the Objectives Resolution introduced by Jawaharlal Nehru, N.G. Ranga said, Sir, there is a lot of talk about minorities. Who are the real minorities? Not the Hindus in the so-called Pakistan provinces, not the Sikhs, not even the Muslims. No, the real minorities are the masses of this country. These people are so depressed and oppressed and suppressed till now that they are not able to take advantage of the ordinary civil rights. What is the position? You go to the tribal areas. According to law, their own traditional law, their tribal law, their lands cannot be alienated. Yet our merchants go there, and in the so-called free market they are able to snatch their lands. Thus, even though the law goes against this snatching away of their lands, still the merchants are able to turn the tribal people into veritable slaves by various kinds of bonds, and make them hereditary bond slaves. Let us go to the ordinary villagers. There goes the moneylender with his money and he is able to get the villagers in his pocket. There is the landlord himself, the zamindar, and the malguzar, and there are the various other people who are able to exploit these poor villagers. There is no elementary education even among these people. These are the real minorities that need protection and assurances of protection. In order to give them the necessary protection, we will need much more than this resolution. CO5 Statutio 5AL Assembly Debate, Volume 2. Source 7. We want removal of our social disabilities. Dakshayani Vilayudan from Madras argued. What we want is not all kinds of safeguards. It is the moral safeguard which gives protection to the underdogs of this country. I refuse to believe that 70 million Harijans are to be considered as a minority. What we want is the immediate removal of our social disabilities. CO5 Statutio 5AL Assembly Debate, Volume A. Source 8. We have never asked for privileges. Hansa Mehta of Bombay demanded justice for women, not reserved seats, or separate electorates. We have never asked for privileges. What we have asked for is social justice, economic justice, and political justice. We have asked for that equality which alone can be the basis of mutual respect and understanding, without which real cooperation is not possible between man and woman. Source 9. Who is a better patriot? Sir A. Ramaswamy Mudaliar from Mysore said during the debate on August 21, 1947. Let us not lay the flattering unction to our soul that we are better patriots if we propose a strong center, and that those who advocate a more vigorous examination of these resources are people with not enough of national spirit or patriotism. Source 10. What should the qualities of a national language be? A few months before his death, Mahatma Gandhi reiterated his views on the language question. This Hindustani should be neither Sanskritist Hindi nor Persianist Urdu, but a happy combination of both. It should also freely admit words wherever necessary from the different regional languages, and also assimilate words from foreign languages, provided that they can mix well and easily with our national language. Thus our national language must develop into a rich and powerful instrument capable of expressing the whole gamut of human thought and feelings. To confine oneself to Hindi or Urdu would be a crime against intelligence and the spirit of patriotism. Harija 5 Savak, October 12, 1947.